The sun was just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the marshlands of Palm Coast, Florida. The air was thick with the scent of salt and earth, and the distant cries of seabirds echoed through the stillness. I had been looking forward to this hike for weeks, a chance to escape the noise of the city and reconnect with nature. Little did I know, this peaceful morning would soon turn into a fight for survival. I had set out early, my trusty walking stick in hand, a weathered piece of hickory that had been my companion on countless hikes. The trail was familiar, a winding path through dense palmetto groves and across wooden boardwalks that spanned the wetlands. I moved at a steady pace, savoring the solitude and the rhythmic crunch of my boots on the sandy path. The world felt alive around me, the rustle of leaves, the occasional splash of a fish in the nearby water, and the distant hum of insects. About an hour into my hike, I reached a particularly secluded section of the trail. The vegetation here was thicker, the palmetto fronds forming a dense canopy overhead. The air felt heavier, almost oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I paused for a moment, scanning the underbrush, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shaking off the unease, I pressed on. It happened so quickly that I barely had time to react. One moment, I was alone on the trail, and the next, two massive shapes burst from the underbrush, charging straight at me. Wild boars. Their dark, bristly fur glistened in the early morning light, and their tusks gleamed like daggers. I froze for a split second, my mind struggling to process the sudden danger. Then instinct took over. I swung my walking stick in a wide arc, aiming for the closest boar. The hickory connected with a sickening thud, and the animal let out a guttural squeal. But it didn't stop. If anything, the blow seemed to enrage it further. The second boar was right behind the first, its beady eyes locked on me with a terrifying intensity. I backpedaled, my heart pounding in my chest as the two animals closed in. The first boar lunged, its tusks slashing through the air. I brought my stick down hard, striking it across the snout. It recoiled, but the second boar was already on me. I felt a searing pain in my thigh as its tusk grazed my leg. I stumbled, but managed to keep my footing, swinging the stick wildly to keep the animals at bay. The air was filled with their snorts and grunts, the sound of their hooves pounding the earth, and my own ragged breaths. I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. My arms were already burning from the effort, and I could feel the warmth of blood trickling down my leg. I needed to find a way to escape, but the boars were relentless, circling me like predators closing in on their prey. I glanced around, searching for anything that could give me an advantage. A fallen tree branch, a rock, anything. But there was nothing. Then I remembered the trail. If I could just make it back to the boardwalk, maybe I could outrun them. It was a long shot, but it was my only chance. I took a deep breath, tightened my grip on the walking stick, and made a break for it. The boars were on me in an instant. I swung the stick with all my strength, catching one of them in the side. It stumbled, giving me a brief opening. I ran, my legs pumping as I pushed myself to move faster than I ever had before. The boardwalk was just ahead, but it felt like miles away. I could hear the boars behind me, their hooves pounding the ground like thunder. I reached the boardwalk and leapt onto it, the wooden planks creaking under my weight. I didn't stop to look back, didn't dare to slow down. I ran, my boots slamming against the wood, until my lungs felt like they were on fire. Finally, I risked a glance over my shoulder. The boars had stopped at the edge of the boardwalk, their eyes still fixed on me, but they didn't follow. I didn't know why, and I didn't care. I kept running until I was sure they were far behind me. When I finally stopped, I was drenched in sweat, my body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. My leg throbbed where the boar had grazed me, and I could feel the bruises already forming on my arms and shoulders. But I was alive. I had made it. I sat down on the boardwalk, my back against the railing, and took a moment to catch my breath. The sun was higher in the sky now, the marshlands bathed in its warm light. It was hard to believe that just a short while ago I had been fighting for my life. I looked down at my walking stick, still clutched tightly in my hand. It was battered and scratched, but it had saved my life. As I sat there, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. I had been attacked by two wild boars, animals I had always thought of as relatively harmless. But these were no ordinary boars. They were massive, aggressive, and relentless. I had been lucky to escape with only a few bruises and a graze. It could have been so much worse. I knew I needed to get back to my car and clean up my wounds, but I couldn't bring myself to move just yet. My mind was still racing, replaying the attack over and over again. I thought about how close I had come to being seriously injured, or worse. I thought about how quickly things had escalated, how one moment I had been enjoying a peaceful hike and the next I was fighting for my life. But I also thought about how I had managed to keep my cool, how I had used my walking stick to defend myself. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle whatever nature threw at me, but this had been a true test of my survival skills, and I had passed. Eventually, I forced myself to stand up. My leg was stiff and sore, but I could still walk. I took one last look back down the trail, half expecting to see the boars still lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing, just the quiet beauty of the marshlands, as if nothing had happened. The hike back to my car was slow and painful, but I made it. I cleaned my wounds as best I could, bandaged them up, and drove home. The bruises would fade, and the cuts would heal, but the memory of that morning would stay with me forever. In the days that followed, I found myself thinking a lot about the attack. I researched wild boars, learning more about their behavior and how to avoid them. I realized how lucky I had been, and how important it was to always be prepared when venturing into the wilderness. I also thought about how fragile life can be, how quickly things can change. But most of all, I thought about the resilience of the human spirit. I had faced a terrifying situation, and I had come out the other side. I had fought back, and I had survived, and that was something I would carry with me, not just as a hiker, but as a person. The wild boars of Palm Coast had taught me a lesson I would never forget. Nature is beautiful, but it can also be unforgiving, and sometimes you have to fight for your place in it. It was a crisp morning when I set out for what I thought would be a peaceful hike through the rugged hills of Turkey's countryside. The air smelled fresh and earthy, tinged with the pine scent that filled the cool early hours. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the rocky trails as I trekked deeper into the wilderness. The landscape around me was surreal. The rolling hills, the quietness, and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. It was the kind of solitude I longed for. I had been hiking solo for years, and there was something about the isolation of it that gave me a sense of clarity. But that morning, things would take a turn I never could have anticipated. The path I had chosen wound through dense woodland and led up toward a higher plateau. I had been walking for a couple of hours, enjoying the challenge of the terrain, when I decided to take a quick break. I found a large boulder perched by the edge of the trail and sat on it, resting my legs and sipping from my water bottle. The quiet was almost meditative. No voices, no traffic, just the distant call of birds and the soft hum of the forest. As I sat there, I remember feeling a strange unease creeping over me, but I dismissed it. It was just my mind playing tricks, I thought. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Perhaps it was because I hadn't seen any other hikers that day. The trail was usually a bit more trafficked, but today I was alone. Without warning, I heard a rustling in the underbrush just ahead of me. The sound was swift, heavy, and out of place in the calm morning. My heart skipped a beat, and I stood up immediately, my senses sharpening. At first I thought it was a deer or a smaller animal moving through the brush. But then I saw it, a massive wild boar emerging from the trees just a few meters in front of me. It was huge. Its thick, coarse fur bristled as it snorted, its tusks gleaming with a menacing gleam. The boar's beady eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that chilled me to the bone. My body froze for a moment, instinctively taking a step back, but the boar wasn't retreating. It was coming straight at me. The ground seemed to vibrate with each heavy step it took. Adrenaline coursed through my veins as I scrambled to grab my walking stick, which had been resting at my side. The boar was charging now, and there was no time to think, only to act. I raised the stick defensively, trying to make myself appear larger, hoping it would back off. But it didn't. With an aggressive snort, the boar lunged forward, its tusks aimed at my chest. In that moment, everything went into overdrive. My heart raced, and the world narrowed to just the two of us. Me and the wild animal charging at me with primal fury. I swung the stick as hard as I could, landing a glancing blow to its head. It recoiled briefly, but didn't stop. Blood roared in my ears as I took a step backward, trying to keep some distance between us. Then, in a flash, I spotted a rock nearby, large and jagged. Desperation guided my actions as I lunged for it, gripping the sharp-edged stone with both hands. The boar was getting closer, and I had to do something, anything, to survive. Without thinking, I hurled the rock straight at the beast. It hit the boar squarely in the side, and it let out a grunt of pain, but it didn't back off. Instead, it was angrier, more frantic. I barely had time to react as the boar lunged at me again, this time knocking me to the ground with a heavy force. The impact left me winded, and the pain was immediate. My arms were scraped against the rough ground, and the boar was on top of me now, its tusks slashing dangerously close to my face. In that split second, I thought I was done for, but something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to go down without a fight. With every ounce of strength I had, I brought the walking stick up and jammed it into the boar's snout. It was enough to make the animal recoil slightly, but it wasn't enough to deter it. As it charged again, I swung the stick with all my might, connecting with the boar's skull. The force of the blow made it stumble back, and I managed to scramble to my feet. Though my knees were weak from the shock and fear, I could feel the adrenaline pulsing in my chest, pushing me beyond my limits. The boar was still coming, and I had no choice but to stand my ground. Every time it lunged at me, I fought back with the stick, swinging and striking, praying that somehow I could end this before it was too late. My body was covered in cuts, bruises, and scratches, and I was trembling from the effort, but I kept fighting. Every swing, every moment of resistance, I knew I was one step closer to survival. It seemed like an eternity, but finally, the boar hesitated, rearing back slightly as if confused by my relentless defense. That was my moment. I lunged at it again, thrusting my walking stick at its face. This time, it didn't charge back. Instead, the animal let out a low grunt and turned, retreating into the woods with a final snort. I watched it disappear into the underbrush, my heart still pounding in my chest, my breathing ragged and shallow. The world around me seemed eerily quiet after the chaos. I stood there for a moment, trembling, my mind racing to process what had just happened. I was alive. I had fought off a wild boar. But the pain was starting to settle in. The cuts on my arms, the bruises forming on my ribs, the deep scratches from where its tusks had grazed my skin. I looked down at my hands, still gripping the walking stick, my knuckles white from the force of my grip. The rock I had thrown lay a few feet away, still half buried in the dirt. I took a moment to catch my breath before slowly making my way back down the trail, every step a reminder of how close I had come to disaster. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, replaced by a deep exhaustion, but I knew I had to keep moving. I needed to get back to safety, to civilization. The walk down was a blur, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time I reached the nearest village, I was barely able to keep my eyes open. My body ached, my clothes were torn, and I was covered in dirt, blood, and scratches. The locals, seeing my disheveled appearance, immediately rushed to help. They gave me water, food, and called for medical attention. It wasn't long before I was being patched up, the wounds on my arms and legs being tended to. When I finally got a moment to sit, I reflected on what had happened. It had been a fight for survival, one I had never expected. I thought of the boar, its ferocity, its strength, and how close I had come to being seriously hurt. I had fought with everything I had, and somehow I had won. In the days that followed, the pain from the bruises and cuts gradually faded, but the memory of that encounter remained. It was a reminder that nature was wild and unpredictable, that even in the most peaceful of settings, danger could strike without warning. But it was also a reminder that sometimes, when faced with the unimaginable, we discover strength within ourselves we didn't know we had. It's been a few years now, but every time I return to those hills in Turkey, I remember that moment. The wild boar, the fight, and the incredible will to survive. And every time I carry with me the knowledge that I can face anything, no matter how unexpected or dangerous it might be. The sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the rugged landscape of New Mexico. I had been hiking for hours, my boots crunching against the dry, cracked earth, the scent of sagebrush and pine filling my nostrils. The trail I'd chosen was remote, one of those lesser-known paths that promised solitude and a chance to reconnect with nature. I'd been craving this, the silence, the vastness, the feeling of being utterly alone in a world that felt too loud, too crowded. But as the shadows grew longer and the air turned cooler, I began to feel a prickling unease crawl up my spine. I'd been warned about the wildlife in these parts, bears, coyotes, and of course mountain lions. But I'd brushed off the concerns. I was an experienced hiker after all. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness, or so I thought. The trail wound through a narrow canyon, the walls rising steeply on either side, their red and orange hues deepening in the fading light. I paused for a moment to take a sip from my water bottle, the cool liquid soothing my parched throat. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to reverberate through the very rocks around me. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, my eyes scanning the shadows for the source of the sound. At first, I saw nothing, just the darkening canyon, the twisted shapes of juniper trees, and the occasional flutter of a bird's wings. But then movement, a flicker of tawny fur, a pair of eyes glowing like embers in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. A mountain lion, its sleek body coiled like a spring, ready to pounce. I'd read about what to do in this situation. Make yourself look bigger. Don't run. Fight back if it attacks. But reading about it and actually facing it were two very different things. My mind raced, my instincts screaming at me to turn and flee, but I forced myself to stay still, to meet the lion's gaze. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. I raised my arms above my head, trying to appear larger. The lion didn't move, its eyes locked on mine, unblinking. I could see the muscles in its shoulders tensing, its tail twitching ever so slightly. It was sizing me up, deciding whether I was prey or a threat. I took a slow step backward, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the lion could hear it. The ground beneath my feet was uneven, littered with loose rocks and dry brush. One wrong move and I could stumble, and that would be it. The lion would be on me in an instant. "Go away!" I yelled again, my voice trembling. I clapped my hands together, the sharp sound echoing off the canyon walls. The lion's ears twitched, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it took a step forward, its movements fluid and deliberate. My stomach churned with fear, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin. I glanced around, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. A rock, a stick, anything. But the ground was bare, and my backpack was too far away to reach without turning my back on the lion. I was trapped, with nowhere to go and nothing to defend myself with. The lion took another step, and then another. It was close now, close enough that I could see the ripple of its muscles beneath its fur, the sharpness of its claws. I could smell it too, a musky, wild scent that made my stomach turn. My mind was a whirlwind of panic and adrenaline, but I forced myself to think, to focus. If I was going to survive this, I needed to stay calm. I bent down slowly, never taking my eyes off the lion, and picked up a handful of dirt and small rocks. With a shaky breath, I hurled it at the lion, shouting as loudly as I could. The lion flinched, its ears flattening against its head, but it didn't back down. Instead, it let out a low, menacing growl that sent a shiver down my spine. And then it lunged. Time seemed to slow as the lion sprang toward me, its powerful body moving with terrifying speed. I barely had time to react, throwing up my arms to protect my face and neck. The impact knocked me off my feet, and I hit the ground hard, the breath driven from my lungs. The lion's weight was crushing, its claws digging into my arms as it snarled and snapped at me. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the canyon. I thrashed and kicked, trying to push the lion off me, but it was like fighting a force of nature. Its teeth grazed my forearm, and I felt a searing pain as they tore through my skin. Blood welled up, hot and sticky, and I knew I was in serious trouble. But I wasn't going to give up. Not like this. not here. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to twist my body, throwing the lion off balance. It stumbled, its claws raking across my side as it tried to regain its footing. I scrambled to my feet, my vision swimming with pain and fear, and grabbed the first thing I could find, a jagged rock about the size of my fist. The lion turned to face me again, its eyes blazing with fury. It crouched low, ready to pounce once more, but I didn't wait. I hurled the rock with all my strength, aiming for its head. The rock struck the lion just above its eye, and it let out a yowl of pain, shaking its head as if to clear it. I didn't wait to see if it would attack again. I turned and ran, my legs pumping as I sprinted down the trail. My lungs burned, and every step sent a jolt of pain through my broken wrist, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me, I could hear the lion's growls, but they were growing fainter, more distant. It wasn't following me. I didn't slow down until I reached the trailhead, my chest heaving and my body trembling with exhaustion. I collapsed onto the ground, my mind reeling with the enormity of what had just happened. I had faced a mountain lion and lived to tell the tale. But as I looked down at my bloodied arms and the jagged cut on my side, I knew I had been lucky. So lucky. The sun had set by the time I made it back to my car, the sky a deep, inky blue. I drove to the nearest hospital, my hands shaking on the wheel, and spent the next few hours getting stitched up and having my wrist set in a cast. The doctors were amazed by my story, and so was I. I had survived an encounter with one of the most fearsome predators in the wild, and all I had to show for it was a broken wrist and a few scars. But as I lay in the hospital bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been marked by the experience in more ways than one. The memory of the lion's eyes, glowing in the shadows, haunted me. I knew I would never forget the sound of its growl, the weight of its body on mine, the smell of its breath as it snapped at me. And I knew that, no matter how much time passed, I would always carry the fear with me, the fear of what could have been, and the knowledge that, in the wild, we are never truly alone. The shadows in the canyon had been watching me that day, and they had almost claimed me. But I had fought back, and I had survived, and that was enough. It was one of those mornings in West Virginia where the mist clung to the hills like a second skin, thick and unyielding. The kind of fog that made the world feel smaller, quieter, as if the mountains had decided to keep their secrets close that day. I had set out early, my boots crunching on the gravel trailhead, my backpack snug against my shoulders. The plan was simple, a solo hike through the Monongahela National Forest, a place I'd been to a dozen times before. I wasn't looking for adventure, just solitude, the kind you can only find when you're miles away from the hum of civilization. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense stands of hemlock and birch, the air cool and damp. Birds called to each other in the distance, their songs muffled by the fog. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how alive the forest felt. But there was something else, too. A tension in the air, a stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I told myself it was just the fog playing tricks on me, the way it distorted sounds and made shadows stretch and twist. But deep down, I knew something was off. I was about 3 miles in when I heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a mix of pain and rage that sent a chill down my spine. I scanned the trees, my eyes straining to pierce the fog, but I saw nothing, just the endless gray and the faint outline of the trail ahead. And then it appeared. At first, it was just a shadow, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. But as it drew closer, I could make out the shape of a fox, small, wiry, its coat a patchy mix of red and gray. It moved strangely, its gait uneven, almost drunken. Its eyes were what got me, though. They were wild, unfocused, and glazed with a kind of manic intensity that made my stomach drop. I knew instantly that something was wrong. The fox stopped about 10 feet away, its body rigid, its lips curled back in a snarl. I could see the foam around its mouth, flecks of white clinging to its fur. My mind raced. Rabies. The word echoed in my head like a warning bell. I'd heard stories, of course, everyone who spends time in the woods has, but I never thought I'd come face to face with it. I took a slow step back, my hands raised in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "Easy," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Easy now." The fox didn't move. It just stared at me, its chest heaving, its breath coming in ragged gasps. For a moment I thought maybe it would leave, that it would lose interest and slink back into the trees. But then it lunged. I barely had time to react. The fox came at me in a blur of teeth and claws, its snarls filling the air. I swung my backpack around, using it as a shield, but the fox was relentless. It latched onto the fabric, thrashing and biting, its claws raking against my arms as I tried to push it away. Pain shot through me, sharp and hot, but I didn't have time to think about it. All I could do was fight. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe seconds, maybe minutes. Time seemed to stretch and warp, the world narrowing to the fox and me, locked in a desperate struggle. I kicked at it, my boots connecting with its body, but it didn't let go. Its teeth sank into my forearm, and I screamed, the sound echoing through the trees. I grabbed a rock from the ground, my fingers closing around it instinctively, and brought it down on the fox's head. Once, twice, until it finally went still. I stumbled back, my chest heaving, my arms trembling. The fox lay at my feet, its body limp, its eyes staring blankly at the sky. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I dropped to my knees, my vision swimming. Blood dripped from the bites on my arm, staining the ground beneath me. I knew I had to move, had to get help, but I couldn't seem to make my body obey. Somehow I managed to get to my feet. I fumbled with my backpack, pulling out my first aid kit and wrapping a bandage around my arm as best I could. The pain was intense, a constant throbbing ache that made it hard to think. But I knew I couldn't stay there. I had to get back to the trailhead, had to find someone who could help me. The hike back was a blur. Every step felt like a battle, my legs heavy and unsteady. The fog seemed to close in around me, the trees looming like silent sentinels. I kept expecting to hear that growl again, to see another pair of glowing eyes in the shadows, but the forest was quiet, eerily so, as if it were holding its breath. When I finally reached the trailhead, I collapsed against my car, my hands shaking as I dug out my phone. The call to 911 was a haze of disjointed words and frantic explanations. I remember the operator's voice, calm and steady, telling me to stay where I was, that help was on the way. I remember the paramedics arriving, their faces a mix of concern and disbelief as they took in my injuries. And I remember the ride to the hospital, the sirens wailing in the distance, the world outside the ambulance windows a blur of motion and color. The doctors told me I was lucky. The bites were deep, but they hadn't hit any major arteries. I'd need a series of rabies shots, which sounded worse than the bites themselves, but it was better than the alternative. As I lay in the hospital bed, my arm bandaged and my body aching, I couldn't help but think about the fox. What had driven it to attack me? Was it the rabies, twisting its mind, turning it into something unrecognizable? Or was it something else, something deeper and more primal? I'll never know for sure. But what I do know is that the forest isn't just a place of beauty and peace. It's also a place of danger, where the line between life and death can be razor thin. That day, I learned that lesson the hard way. And while I'll never forget the fear, the pain, the sheer terror of that encounter, I also know that it's a part of me now, a story I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Because in the end, that's what we are, stories. And sometimes, the most unforgettable ones are the ones we never saw coming.